Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 17 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. I'm excited to be speaking today with Toby Harnden. Toby served as an officer in the British Royal Navy, graduated from Oxford University, worked as a foreign news correspondent in 38 different countries, and has focused on terrorism and war throughout his career. His newest book is First Casualty, The Untold Story of the CIA Mission to Avenge 9/11. Now, it almost goes without saying that this is an incredibly timely book to be discussing right now, what with the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks upon us. I just finished reading this book recently, and I found it to be absolutely riveting. It's primarily about the men of Team Alpha, the first Americans to go into enemy territory in Afghanistan in October of 2001. And it turns out that there was so much more that I never knew about those first few weeks and months after 9/11, even though I was glued to my television set, as was everyone else at that time. Toby, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this amazing story that you've documented. What was it?
Well, thanks, Justin.
Sure.
And thank you for those kind words, and it's great to be on the podcast.
I appreciate it. What was it that led you to write this book, and how did you go about talking to all these people who were on the ground at that time, these frontline CIA operatives?
Yeah, well, it probably goes back to 9/11. I mean, like you, I was sort of riveted by the news. I mean, I was in the news media at the time. I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11. And it was sort of, the story of my life. And I covered the US intensively in the following months. And the story of Mike Spann being killed in the prison uprising at Kalajangi, it popped up. I was, fascinated by this CIA officer, former Marine Corps officer, and I was very touched by Shannon Spann. And so but then we all moved on, and Afghanistan seemed to be over. Everybody was getting ready for Iraq. But, the story of Mike Spann always stuck in my mind. And then a couple of years later, I was in Iraq, actually, funnily enough, and another reporter said to me, "Did you ever see the footage of that CIA officer, sort of running for his life in the fort, the incident when Mike Spann was killed?" And I hadn't seen it, and I looked at the video of David Tyson, running with his pistol in his hand. And I remember thinking then, like, wow, what was going through his mind? What he just been through. And then, fast forward a few more years, and I'm in the US, and I decided to try and track down David Tyson. And eventually I contacted an academic, Indiana University, who thanked him in a thesis or footnote or something. He put me in touch with him. And so I met David about 8 years ago, and it just so happened he lived nearby in Vienna, Virginia, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and he was friendly. He couldn't talk very much. He was still serving in the CIA, and, contact kind of dropped off a bit. I always tried to keep the lines of communication open, and then at the beginning of last year, he sent me an email and was like, "I've just retired, I'm ready to talk." And so I just sort of took it from there, really. I went to see him and spent a long time with him, listening to his story. And then I just kind of moved outwards. J.R. Seeger, the chief, was also retired and was writing thrillers, so I contacted him. Justin Sapp still is a serving Green Beret. He's now a colonel. I could see him on LinkedIn. And so I just sort of slowly but surely built up the trust and credibility with the members of the team, and tried to get across to them that I was serious, that I didn't have an agenda, that I was going to be sort of meticulous and responsible in the way that I sort of dealt with the subject, which was obviously extremely sort of emotional and close to their hearts. And then I was always a little bit worried about whether the CIA might try and hinder me because they might have some kind of other project, or they just didn't want me to do it or something. But at a certain point, when I felt that I had enough to be able to write a book on this, I contacted them, and they'd already heard about what I was doing, unsurprisingly. And they were helpful, actually. They helped facilitate some interviews with serving personnel, with some of the retirees who were still contractors and who wanted the sort of agency okay. They didn't open the vaults. They didn't give me classified cables or anything like that, but they did help. And that really, meant that I was able to sort of round off the picture in the end.
That's fantastic. It's your connection with these guys that really comes through in the book, because they're very open, it seems, with their fears, both before and during and after all of the events that took place. This dawning realization that we're entering like a generation of warfare, which hit some people faster than others. It's really amazing to see that all playing out in, the fall of 2001, how some people kind of implicitly understood what was coming faster than others. That really was an interesting insight in the book, I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I try to, when I'm doing interviews, I try to sort of make them like conversations and have them sort of free flowing and go off on tangents. And, I am interested in people. And the longer I've sort of worked as a journalist and author, the more I think it's very important to listen to people, to listen to what they say, to talk about sometimes the things they want to talk about, and not try and have this sort of sense of just trying to get stuff from them. So, yeah, I mean, and, one of the tragedies in this, many tragedies, but I feel that Mike Spann, talking to his widow, Shannon, and obviously the guys in the team that knew him, he was one of the ones that grasped the sort of al-Qaeda threat before 9/11. And I mean, there was a conversation he had with a guy called Brian, who is still serving in the CIA, was also a former Marine Corps officer. Brian told me that he and Mike have been talking about the USS Cole attack in December 2000, and how, if the crew of that ship had not, very courageously managed to save the ship after it was, suicide bomb by al-Qaeda in Yemen, then everything would have been different. And they were on a training course, and Mike said to Brian, well, we probably wouldn't be on this course. And so, I think Mike Spann, all these team members, but I think certainly Mike Spann was sort of seized by the moment and the gravity of it, because they were going to be directly involved. But they also realized, it's almost become a little bit of a cliche, but everything had changed. And so, yeah, it's kind of poignant to think about that now.
It really is. And it's good that there was guys like him, and David Tyson as well seems like exactly the right man for the job. He was the right man in the right place at the right moment of history is kind of my takeaway from the book. I know that he was in, I think it was Uzbekistan at the time. Can you tell us a little bit about the CIA understanding of and involvement in that region before the 9/11 attacks? Were they sending the best of the best? Was al-Qaeda a high priority for them at the time, for example?
Well, no, that's a good question. So David Tyson was based in Tashkent in Uzbekistan, and really I think two operations officers in the CIA station there, so a very small station. David was a former academic. He was a not native, but almost native Uzbek speaker. He was the only Uzbek speaker actually in the CIA at the time. But he had been sort of immersed in Central Asia and had lived there at one point and didn't possess a pair of shoes, nearly sort of gone native. So he was one of the people who was focused on Afghanistan. Within the counterterrorism center at CIA, led by Kofa Black, then there was certainly a very sort of intense feeling about the al-Qaeda threat. We'd had the bombings in 1998 of the two US embassies in Africa. I mentioned the Cole bombing. There was another unsuccessful suicide bomb operation against the USS the Sullivans before the Cole. And so within CTC, Counterterrorism Center, there was a real sense that al-Qaeda was going to strike, and al-Qaeda and bin Laden were based in Afghanistan. I think the Clinton administration wanted to treat it more as sort of a law enforcement type of thing, and there was a lot of CIA officers believed that they didn't have the authority to kill bin Laden before 9/11. The incoming Bush administration appeared to be sort of focused more on sort of nation state threats. So, I mean, Kofa Black and Rich Blee and some of these people at CIA felt that they were sort of voices in the wilderness. But in the 2 years before 9/11, there had been CIA teams going into Afghanistan, and they'd be going into the Panjshir via Dushanbe in Tajikistan, and the code name was Jawbreaker, and they were going in on old former Soviet Mi-17 helicopters that were owned by the Northern Alliance and Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was assassinated 2 days before 9/11. So there was a relationship with the Northern Alliance. It was fairly small, and the CIA, in particular CTC, was always pushing to sort of to do more. But it was there, and once 9/11 happened, it did sort of give the CIA a sort of bridgehead inside Afghanistan.
Okay. Did they have a positive working relationship with the Northern Alliance, or was it just kind of, keeping the lines of communication open, or were the Northern Alliance trying to, just get a few extra weapons or funds or anything from the CIA? I mean, how was that relationship leading up to the first week of September?
Well, it was positive, certainly, but it was limited. I mean, the Northern Alliance, they wanted to overturn the Taliban regime. That was not US policy. The US was focused on al-Qaeda and bin Laden. There were CIA officers, including David Tyson, Rich Blee, who was the head of Alex Station, the bin Laden unit within the counterterrorism center at CIA, who was saying, like, the al-Qaeda threat is growing. They're going to hit the homeland. We need to do more for the Northern Alliance, because the Northern Alliance was about to be overrun just before 9/11, and the Panjshir was about to be cleared. As it appears, it's just been cleared by the Taliban this week or this weekend. The relationship wasn't as developed as it maybe could have been or would have been, if 9/11 had happened later. So, for instance, there was no relationship with Abdul Rashid Dostum, the ethnic Uzbek warlord. I'll just clarify a little bit. There was a relationship, but it was through the Uzbek intelligence service. So there was not a direct connection. I think really probably within weeks or certainly a couple of months, David Tyson, as the CIA's Uzbek speaker, he would have been talking to Dostum, but it hadn't happened. So it was limited. Both sides, the Northern Alliance and certain figures in counterterrorism center, wanted it to be more, but it was sort of enough to give the CIA and the US the in they needed after 9/11.
Okay, I see. It's very, very tragic that Ahmad Shah Massoud was assassinated just 2 days before September 11th by that al-Qaeda hit team that successfully killed him, because he would have been maybe not the perfect candidate or our perfect man in Afghanistan, but certainly the best man in Afghanistan from everything I've read. And with Dostum, I know he's a key figure in the book. What was the opinion of Dostum prior to him taking kind of center stage in this fight?
Well, the reputation of Dostum was one of somebody who had switched sides, who had fought for the Soviets against the Mujahideen. There were questions about human rights abuses. There was evidence that he drank. And so, he was sort of kept at arm's length by the US government, including the CIA. Now, David Tyson was pushing to meet him and deal with him, but, most people in the US government didn't want to. And almost immediately after this period, he was persona non grata once again, and, has not visited the United States in the past 20 years, and indeed wasn't allowed to. So, it's sort of, you talked about the sort of the right person, if not the perfect person, and that's very much what Dostum was. I mean, he was the one who sort of took the fight to the Taliban, where the Tajiks in the Panjshir, after Massoud had been killed, were not moving quickly. They wanted sort of more money. They wanted more US airstrike. Dostum and his, his cavalry fighters really wanted to take on the Taliban. So it was, Team Alpha loved Dostum because he wanted to fight, and his interests at that point aligned exactly with America's interests.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just temporary allies there. He seems like such a true warlord, a man who's willing to do, what was necessary to protect the interests of himself and his tribe, really, no matter what was happening. So he was such a critical figure
Yeah,
for such a short
yeah, yeah.
period.
No, he's a fascinating figure, larger than life. And I was able to meet him at the end of
Oh
last
wow,
year, which was, it was fascinating.
I can imagine. I can imagine. My goodness. So after the attacks, there's obviously a huge amount of scrambling to figure out how to respond. And there's a lot of guys, these men of action that you talked about, that wanted to go and needed to go for sure. So how, out of all the volunteers for this mission, how were these first team members for Team Alpha chosen, and were they the right people for the job that they were handed, this unbelievably critical new scenario that they were thrown into?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of interesting. So Kofa Black and Hank Crompton, who was his deputy, he just started as a CIA station chief in Canberra in Australia, and got back after 9/11, got on a plane and came back and ran the war sort of day to day, while Kofa Black dealt with more of the sort of the politics in Washington. So their sort of concept of the teams, it's interesting, because I think maybe your average person, if they think about it, would sort of imagine the CIA teams that went in after 9/11 would be sort of like the SEAL team that went to get bin Laden in 2011. Elite, with all the right kits, with night vision. They'd done these operations dozens or scores of times before. Something went wrong with a helicopter, they immediately had a plan B, and it sort of was almost like clockwork. That was not how this was with CIA team and Team Alpha after 9/11. The idea was that some of them would be elite sort of warriors, and four of the 8 were CIA paramilitaries. But there were 2 case officers. So J.R. Seeger, the chief, was a diary speaker who'd been stationed in Islamabad in the 80s and had dealt with the Mujahideen when they were fighting against the Soviets then. David Tyson, we've talked about, he was an Uzbek speaker and sort of former academic. There was a medic on the team, Mark Rausenberger. There was a Green Beret on the team. So it was kind of an eclectic bunch. And the idea was that these were not just gunslingers. And in fact, J.R. Seeger's direction was basically, you shouldn't be using your weapons. You shouldn't be firing your weapons except in extremis. I mean, it ended up that 4 out of the 8 did fire their weapons, but they were there to primarily deal with the tribal rivalries and sort of manipulate and negotiate with the different ethnic groups so that they would align with US interests. The Green Berets, who came in 3 days after Team Alpha, they were focused on the tactical sort of battlefield and defeating the Taliban with the Northern Alliance and calling in airstrikes, whereas the CIA guys were gathering intelligence and focusing very much on al-Qaeda. A lot of the guys on Team Alpha, they'd never met each other before they got to Uzbekistan, or a few days before in CIA headquarters. David Tyson was based in Tashkent and didn't join the team until late, and hadn't met several of them before. So they just sort of improvised and adapted and got on with it. And that was the sort of the nature of things after 9/11. And I think, you hear different stories about different teams, but I think Team Alpha was very well sort of balanced and very sort of cohesive. And it worked really, given how sort of last minute a lot of the organization was. It's remarkable that it worked so well.
Yeah, they definitely sound like the right men for the job from what I've read, but they're dropping into this completely chaotic situation where they don't have enough intelligence going in. They have to develop it, of course. So what kind of problems did they initially face in the very first hours and very first few days of their time on the ground in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, the very sort of rudimentary practical things, but important. So, I mean, they had to ride horses, They were in the mountains, and that was the primary mode of transport, and a number of them had basically never ridden before. The saddles were incredibly uncomfortable and were built for much smaller people than sort of burly Americans. The stirrups were too high, so you had all that. A lot of them got GI issues, diarrhea and vomiting, and so you'd be taken out for a day or two. There were problems of mines everywhere from the various sort of campaigns over the years. And then at I guess sort of a higher level, they had to work out what the kind of tribal and ethnic patchwork there was going on, how the relationships on the ground were working. So Dostum was nominally in charge of commanding Atta Muhammad Noor, who was a Tajik warlord in the Darya Suf and Balkh Valley, south of Mazar-i-Sharif. Now, Atta believed that he was senior to Dostum, and Atta, being a Tajik, had a line to the Tajiks in the Panjshir Valley and Fahim Khan, who'd taken over from Ahmad Shah Massoud. And for a week or 10 days or so, I mean, there was a possibility that Atta might actually attack Dostum. I mean, he was very upset that Dostum had the Americans, Dostum had the cash, Dostum was getting the supplies. And so J.R. Seeger, the chief of Team Alpha, had to smooth these ruffled feathers, and he had to work with Atta, and in fact he split up Team Alpha, so three of the 8 of Team Alpha went to join with Atta, and then another team came in, just a 3-man team, Team Bravo, came in to work with Atta. An ODA, the 12-man Green Beret team, came in with Atta. It was agreed that Atta would get supply drops and ammunition and food and cash, as well as Dostum. And so there was this sort of process of almost sort of literally getting them to point in the same direction rather than point against each other. And in the end, it worked, because both Atta and Dostum defeated the Taliban in battle and jointly took Mazar-i-Sharif. But it could have been different. You could have had a situation where attacked Dostum and, killed some of the CIA guys. I mean, these were the sort of risks and the unknowns at the time.
Yeah, amazingly complex situation on the ground there. And it's unfortunate that we only had, one David Tyson, one Uzbek speaker, for example, and not a lot of subject matter experts or native born dual citizens or anything like that, that we could drop in for sure. That's amazing to think that, you think it's going to be the U.S. and the Northern Alliance versus the Taliban, but it's actually separate elements of the Northern Alliance that might attack each other at any moment, unless you kind of thread the needle, so to speak, with the negotiations and the support of the different tribes. And just an incredible situation for these guys to be dropped into, and the entire world watching them as well. So what a moment in time that was, for certain.
Yeah. Sort of the nature of Afghanistan, there was lots of kind of hints and sort of foretellings of the complexity of the country in these early weeks.
Right, absolutely. And I know that is a tremendously different place. I don't necessarily want to call it backwards in some ways, but the life of the average Afghan in northern Afghanistan was vastly different. And suddenly these Americans are showing up, dropping out of the sky, bringing all these supplies and everything. So what kind of culture clash was occurring in addition to the conflict that was going on in the country between the Americans and their new partners?
Oh, yeah, it was a real culture clash. I mean, but there was a lot of sort of joking and sort of camaraderie built through that, really. I mean, the Americans the Team Alpha brought in $3 million in cash, all in $100 bills. And so, when they went to the market and wanted to buy a few sheep, then they were paying $100, which was sort of distorting the economy. And the supply drops would sometimes go astray, and you'd have sort of, very poor villagers trying to get the supplies. And some of Dostum's men, I mean, there's one sort of incident I recount in the book where one of Dostum's men just shoots one of the villagers in the chest who's trying to get the supplies, and he's basically saying, "Well, I told them not to, and they're stealing our stuff." And clearly, for Americans, that's not the culture. And so, Team Alpha and the CIA had to sort of acclimatize themselves to that. I mean, it was also sort of amusing incidents. So there was a sort of particularly some of the Uzbeks, not Muslims, but not particularly religious. And so they would come and knock on David Tyson's door and ask for devil's water for medicinal purposes, which was vodka. And so David and Alex Hernandez, who was the team deputy chief, they wanted more money, and they ordered some vodka from Tashkent. And I think it was Alex who joked and said, "Oh yeah, and we'll have some condoms as well." Some condoms were duly sent, and David said that these were for the rifles. You put them over the rifle muzzle to keep dirt and water out of them, which was something that actually did happen in World War II and in Vietnam. but these Afghans could see, sort of alluring females, sort of depicted on the packaging, and there was lots of sort of debate about what these things were really for. So David told them what they were for, and these guys' eyes were like saucers. They couldn't believe it. The concept of contraception just didn't make any sense to them. They were trying these condoms on, and it was sort of actually getting in the way of sort of business, because they were so sort of agitated. And so in the end, David sat them down and said, listen, I'm sorry I said that stupid thing that these things were to put on your penises to stop you having children. I was just I was just playing a joke on you. Really, they're just to keep your rifles clean. And so let's get back to work. So, the cultural clash thing was a source of a challenge, but also a source of amusement at times.
Oh my gosh. Incredible culture clash there for sure. So if I understand correctly, it's only the 8-man Team Alpha is there, and they're joined by this operational detachment 595, I think. So around 20 or fewer Americans at this time, but they have this incredible impact on the Northern Alliance's fight against the Taliban. So can you talk a little bit about the technology and the strategy that the Americans were able to bring to this fight to turn it in the favor of the Northern Alliance so quickly?
Yeah, sure. So it ended up being, it was a little more than that. So the Team Alpha was 8, the ODA was 12, and then you later had a battalion element in early November that came in, which was another probably 10 or so. And then with ATA, you had Team Bravo, which was 3, and then you had an ODA of 12. So there were growing numbers of Americans, but still, compared to the number of Afghans in Northern Alliance, a very small number. And across the country, really, hundreds of Americans, rather than the 100,000 plus that we ended up getting around 2011. So, what the Americans brought principally in terms of the battlefield was air power. And that's what made the difference. And so early on, the ODA famously became known as the Horse Soldiers, and they were depicted in the 12 Strong movie. They were working to coordinate really cavalry charges, sort of like 19th century style cavalry charges from Dostum's men with US air power. And clearly, if you don't coordinate those properly, then things can go wrong. And it was really a device called the soft lamp, a laser-guided system for designating targets that made the difference. And so along with the ODA, you had U.S. Air Force combat controllers, JTACs, coming in with soft lamps, and they were able to get forward and direct the airstrikes with sort of great precision. Once that was worked out, and it took a little while, but once that was worked out, that's what just changed the military equation and was probably the single biggest factor for defeating the Taliban on the battlefield.
Yeah, it seems like once they worked that out, they really rolled up the territory that they wanted very quickly. I think it was 40 days on the ground or so, and they had taken Mazar-i-Sharif, and Kabul had initially fallen as well.
Yeah, I think even a little bit less than that, because Team Alpha got on the ground, depends when you start and when you finish, but Team Alpha got on the ground October the 17th, and Mazar-i-Sharif fell on, I think it was November the 9th, and cut 3 days later. So the Taliban collapsed almost as quickly as the Afghan government under Ghani collapsed last month.
At
the time, it seemed like a record.
Yes, yeah. Well, history tends to repeat itself, unfortunately. Well, so your book, of course, is called First Casualty because it's about the death of Mike Spann, the very first American to die on the ground, and that occurred at the Qali-i Jangi fortress that you mentioned earlier. So can you kind of run us through that? That's a main segment of your book and absolutely riveting stuff for sure. So can you tell us a little bit about what actually happened, all the circumstances that led to this prisoner uprising in November 2001?
Yeah. So Mazar on November the 9th, and I think Team Alpha and the Green Berets sort of entered the city on November the 10th, and that was the first, first city to fall. And they went, and so when the Americans arrived, they went into this fort, which a 19th century fort, sort of mud. I mean, I've been to the place; it's incredible. It looks like something from the Arabian Nights. And so they lived there for a couple of weeks. It'd been used by the Taliban before that had been, and it was a stronghold. It was obviously heavily fortified, but people got sick there. It was outside the city, and so the decision was taken that they should move into a place that became known as the Turkish School, which 5-story sort of modern building in the center of Mazar-i-Sharif. But so in this period, sort of November the 9th and November the 25th, I think a lot of people at CENTCOM, at Task Force Dagger in Uzbekistan, sort of felt that this was sort of over, in Mazar-i-Sharif, and that the big fight was going to be in Kunduz over to the east, where the Taliban had a sort of last stand in the north. And so attention was focused on Kunduz, and there were the surrender negotiations between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance. And what happened was Mullah Fazl, who was just announced today, was going to be the Deputy Defense Minister, which was a position he held in 2001. Sort of a notorious character, cited by the UN as having carried out massacres of Shia Hazaras in the north. He had al-Qaeda fighters under his command as well as Taliban, and he negotiated a surrender with Dostum. And there were about 400 or so prisoners, really al-Qaeda rather than Taliban. There were foreign fighters, no Afghans among them. And they surrendered on November the 24th outside Mazar-i-Sharif. And Dostum and the Americans decided that the safest place to put them was inside Kalajangi. So they were taken there. That night there was suicide. A grenade was exploded, killed a couple of Dostum's commanders. A journalist was wounded. It was chaotic, and the prisoners were put in a cellar of the Pink House, which was a building inside the fortress. Now, it turned out that sort of Afghan custom was that searches of surrendered fighters were often sort of cursory, and so these al-Qaeda guys were not properly searched. And so the following day, David Tyson and Mike Spann went to Kalajangi to start sort of interrogating the prisoners, start sort of sifting through. And it was, again, there was a sort of urgency to it because there was a sense here in the US that there could be another al-Qaeda attack any day, and so it was sort of imperative to find out who these people were, check whether any of them had any relationships with bin Laden or knew of any attacks, and they just didn't know. And so, I mean, it seems extraordinary with hindsight, which hindsight's a wonderful thing, that sort of two CIA officers would go into the fort on their own to interrogate 400 prisoners. I mean, things they weren't really on their own because there was a Northern Alliance guard force of about 40 or 50. And, as we've discussed, Team Alpha had worked with the Northern Alliance, considered them sort of trusted allies. And every day in Afghanistan, this period was a risk. And this was just sort of another day sort of fraught with risk. But, I mean, I think I was able to establish with close to certainty that this was a planned uprising. And really, it was Mullah Fazl. He wanted to take back Mazar-i-Sharif because there were other Taliban groups that were sort of gravitating towards Mazar-i-Sharif at around the same time. And I think Fazl's plan was to entice the bulk of the Americans to Kunduz, leaving the Turkish school and Mazar-i-Sharif sort of underprotected, stage this uprising at the fort, break out and go in, kill Americans inside the schoolhouse, and at the same time attack the Americans who were in Kunduz. And it was a sort of a long shot, but it wasn't that far off succeeding. And so November the 25th, sort of around about just after 11 o'clock in the morning, the last prisoners were being brought out of the cellar of the Pink House, and suddenly there were shots and muffled explosions and a few gunfire, and Mike Spann wheeled around with his Kalashnikov and killed 2 or 3 of the prisoners that were advancing on him. Others jumped on his back. He got his pistol out, killed a couple, and then sort of disappeared, under a pile of prisoners. And and that was the uprising.
Okay, so this was like a coordinated move by the prisoners, and it started with these guys coming out of that cell in the Pink House that you mentioned, right? And they had not been properly searched at that point. Some of them had weapons. They were able to overcome some of the guards. So, and Mike was the first one to go down. He went down shooting for sure, but he was overwhelmed because he was out there mostly on his own. And so what happened in the next few minutes? I mean, did they realize initially there'd already been an explosion the day before? Did everybody realize what this was in the first 5 seconds? I mean, there must have been mass confusion with gunshots going off inside the compound.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, the attacks the night before were a factor. And in fact, Task Force Dagger, the US military sort of in command of the operation, had told Green Berets not to go to the fort on the 25th because of the danger of that suicide attack. So, and I think and I've talked to David Tyson a lot about this. I mean, throughout that morning, there was a growing sort of sense of this wasn't quite right. There were weapons being confiscated from the prisoners, but there was a big pile of weapons. And so, what happened basically was time slowed down, as it does in very sort of stressful situations. But I think David was kind of taking it in, and fortunately, and maybe again a sort of slight foretelling of the collapse of the Afghan army this year, the guard force, which on paper seemed like it was enough to guard the prisoners and deal with any eventuality, once things started to go wrong, most of the guards ran. And the ones that didn't were killed pretty quickly. And David, basically, I mean, we've talked about this a lot, because he was extremely brave because he didn't run and he went to help Mike Spann. But David's sort of counter to this is it wasn't a conscious decision. It was just, he heard Mike shout, "Dave, Dave, Dave," and he just moved towards him. There was a prisoner coming at David with a pistol en route. David killed him with his own pistol, and he got to where Mike Spann was, and there were 4 al-Qaeda guys on top of Mike, and David jumped on top of them and killed all 4 of them. He shot them each twice, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 3, 2, 1, and all sorts of, as you can imagine, chaos and confusion. He kicked Mike, who didn't move. There was blood on the ground, and so it seemed that he was dead. But all this happened in seconds. So David picked up Mike's rifle. There were prisoners sort of flinging themselves at David. Some of them like sort of headbutting him. A lot of them were still tied up. And David ended up just having to shoot his way out into the northern compound. And I don't know how many people he killed, and he doesn't know, but at least a dozen, probably 2 dozen, maybe up to 40 in that sort of, we sort of worked out it was about 11 minutes. And I mean, the odds of him surviving, I don't know what they would have been, but very, very small. But he managed to get out to relative safety to a building which was Dostum's old headquarters, a headquarters building on the northern end of the fort, and he sort of burst in there. And there were a bunch of Afghans and some German TV crew, various people taking shelter. And of course, David had to sort of summon help. Airstrikes were needed, a rescue force was needed. And so, he was there until dusk, trying to sort all that out, while there was a real heavy volume of fire coming into the headquarters building. There were people on the roof who were being shot, Northern Alliance people. So it was a day of chaos and sort of problem upon problem.
This whole section of your book is just, I couldn't put it down as I was reading it. It's really unbelievable stuff. This second by second and minute by minute description of what went on in the prison, especially since you got to talk to so many people, including some of the doctors that were inside you mentioned in the book, and a couple of the guards, I think, and the camera crew. And it's amazing to me, David, like you said, he's a former academic. He, loved the culture and the region. He was not a paramilitary operative. He just had a little bit of training to become a case officer. But, faced with this situation, he was the man of the hour. No question. I'm shocked that he survived that completely, and that he was able to keep it together in any way, shape, or form after that just massacre that he went through, that bloodbath in the prison. And he made it out and was able to keep his wits long enough to survive and direct counterattack and everything.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible, isn't it, really? Because most of us, thankfully, are never tested in that way. We all, I think, sort of hope that if something really bad happened, think about what would you have done, if you'd been in the World Trade Center, on 9/11, would you have sort of obeyed instructions and just stayed at your desk? Would you have panicked and sort of run down the steps, knocking sort of disabled people and sort of elderly people sort of out of the way? Or would you have sort of stepped up and been calm and helped and tried to do something positive? And really, we don't know, do we? Because it hasn't happened to us. With David, the 8 members of Team Alpha, he had the least military experience. And if you'd have picked one of them to be able to deal with the situation, you would have picked somebody like Mike Spann. Now, the fact that it was David that was challenged in this way and Mike Spann wasn't was just because Mike Spann was right next to the pink house and he was killed almost immediately. And so it fell to this guy who in some ways, an everyman in a way, you can sort of relate to him being, if you meet him, he's very unassuming, just kind of like you or me. But it is incredible. And he says it wasn't a decision, that it's just something that's inside, and survival instinct obviously kicks in because he had to kill or be killed. There was no sort of moral dilemma there. But yeah, it's incredible. And it was amazing for me to talk to David because he's somebody who's prepared to go really sort of, go deep on this stuff and think about it. And he spent the last 20 years processing what happened.
Yeah, I can imagine that's something that he probably hasn't gone a day without thinking about that. I would have to imagine, since it happened 20 years ago.
Yeah, he still has nightmares sort of six days out of 7. And, he thinks about it a lot. It's something he's incorporated into his life, really. And, mostly for, in positive ways. He talks about Mike died and David lived. And so David has to make it worth it. He has to make his life worth it. And so he enjoys nature and the good things in life, and he appreciates life in a way that maybe some of us don't, because we take it for granted. And for him, he doesn't take it for granted.
I can imagine. Yeah, that's a very good perspective to keep, for sure. So Mike dies in the first minutes, and David is able to make his way out initially, but they're kind of stuck, and the prisoners have taken over much of the compound. So how was this uprising eventually quelled in the next few hours or days?
So David was kind of holed up in headquarters building. He managed to get a cell phone from the TV crew, and he called Tashkent. He spoke to his wife, who probably dropped the phone, then picked it up again and took some notes. He got through to the embassy, and so word got to the Turkish school that there was a big problem, and they could some of them who'd been out on a mission had heard the gunfire, and one of Dostum's men went to the Turkish school as well and sort of raised the alarm. So there was a sort of a pickup team assembled. It was a 15-man team. It was led by Mark Micheal, who was a Green Beret major, who was on the battalion staff, but he was a trained and experienced special forces operator. He led the team. There were 8 British Special Boat Service guys, UK Special Forces, who sort of, were the UK's contribution in northern Afghanistan at the time. They painted their Land Rovers white. They'd been ordered to do that because Tony Blair wanted a sort of peacekeeping mission. And they weren't in Kunduz, actually, because they weren't allowed to take offensive action. They weren't allowed to assault. They could only sort of shoot at people when they'd been shot at. And so the SBS were like, well, we're not going to do that. So all those sort of niceties were jettisoned. There was a couple of guys from DIA, an Air Force lieutenant colonel who was a Russian linguist, and a major. There was Glenn, who was a CIA medic from Team Bravo, one of the guys who went in on Team Bravo to work with Atta. Among the SBS, there was the 8 SBS, there was a Navy SEAL called Steph Bass, who was on an exchange posting with the Brits. So you had this sort of impromptu group of people who, a bit like Team Alpha, going into the unknown. These guys drove literally toward the sound of gunfire at the fort and didn't know what they were going to encounter. Mitchell had lived in the fort when the Americans first got to Mazar-i-Sharif, and that was invaluable. Afghans were in absolute sort of chaos, but eventually the SBS got there GPMGs, general purpose machine guns, up on one of the towers and started killing a lot of al-Qaeda, and were on the other side of the fort, and they were shooting anybody that came through the central gateway from the southern compound where the pink house was into the northern compound. And then once again airstrikes. So Mark Micheal had to make the difficult decision about whether to call in airstrikes, because it wasn't confirmed. It was assumed. Others did a sort of flanking move around to the opposite side of the fort. So Steph Bass, Tony, who was one of the SBS guys, Mark Micheal, and Glenn, that Mike Spann was dead, but it wasn't absolutely confirmed. But Micheal made the decision to call in airstrikes. So the 500-pound JDAMs that were dropped in the southern compound, and that made a big difference as well. Steph Bass, just at dusk, went forward and was able to get on one of the towers, the western tower that gave him a view inside the southern compounds, and he saw a figure prone with blue jeans and a black fleece, which was clearly sort of Western gear. And Steph Bass fired some shots either side of the legs of the figure to see if there was any flinching or any movement. So the presumption was that it was Mike Spann and that he was dead. And so the Northern Alliance were left there that night. Some prisoners almost certainly got out. We know actually some were killed by local villagers. Some perhaps escaped, and the Uzbek fighters who probably could have got out and got into Uzbekistan. The next morning on the 26th, the plan was to drop a 2,000-pound JDAM right on top of the pink house and basically kill everybody in the southern compound. Unfortunately, the fog of war, it was the early days when airstrikes had not been called in combat very often. The coordinates got switched, and rather than being dropped on the pink house, the JDAM was dropped on the northeastern tower of the fort, which was a friendly position, flipped over a T-55 tank, killed the crew, Northern Alliance. 5 Americans were wounded, the first Purple Hearts of the Afghanistan war, and some of the SBS as well, but no Americans or British killed. But that really finished things off that day. And then that night you had AC-130s who just got into Uzbekistan exactly the right time. I think that was the turning point in terms of the Battle of the Fort. Once the AC-130 gunships went in, they were able to kill a lot more. And then it was really just the remnants. But it took another 3 or 4 days to actually completely pacify that fort. And there were still 86 al-Qaeda, including an American called John Walker Lind, who were remaining in the cellar of the pink house at the end of this thing.
Okay, I see. And what were the after effects of this prisoner uprising? How did these Americans on the ground, how did they kind of continue the mission after this terrible loss of Mike and the kind of the shock of all this violence that was all around them?
Well, it was kind of the end of the mission for the CIA. So David was able to go to Mike Spann's funeral, and other team members were as well, at Arlington Cemetery. It became the mission changed. So troops sort of flooded into Mazar-i-Sharif. The Green Berets stayed in the Turkish schoolhouse, but more and more military arrived. And one of the sort of ironies and tragedies really of this early period was it had been so successful so quickly that the policymakers back in Washington, well, 2 things really. One, the mission in time sort of expanded to, rather than just sort of helping the light footprint, helping the Afghans fight a sort of Afghan war, it became, let's try and build a centralized Western style democracy and essentially build a nation. And then the other thing that happened, I think, was there was a sense that regime change could be done quickly with very few casualties and relatively easily, and that democracy would just naturally sort of flow after that. And so let's go do Iraq and change another regime. And so that led us to sort of take our eye off the ball in Afghanistan, and the Taliban, as we know, sort of crept back. So this whole period was sort of a moment, in history where the complexities and the problems of Afghanistan were very apparent, But I think the success led us to make some decisions which, in hindsight, which is a wonderful thing, perhaps weren't the wisest ones. And that's really set us on the course that's just ended in the sort of catastrophe, really, for the US of the end of this war.
Oh, I know, absolutely. It's hard to look at it without looking through that prism of just the past couple of months, of course. Do you think that from all of your research and from talking to the people on the ground in the first few days, was it inevitable that the Taliban eventually would return? I mean, you're talking about the shifting alliances and the, just the completely different perspective and outlook on governance and tribalism and everything in the country. So was there ever a chance that this experiment would work out, in your opinion, that, they would adapt some kind of Western style and Western supported governance?
Yeah, so I don't think the return of the Taliban was inevitable by any stretch. I think a sort of messy middle ground was possible, and even up until the last few months, potentially could have been maintained with a small, relatively small American force of I think Trump had 5,000 troops towards the end of his administration, and then brought it down to 2,500. I think we shot for the moon really and tried to achieve perfection, and I think perfection and a sort of functioning, democratic, centralized nation state in Afghanistan was not possible. But I think something much, much better than what we're about to see in Afghanistan was possible, and that's part of the tragedy of it.
It really is. Yeah, I don't think there's any going back at this point, for sure. So, of course, writing a book like this, it takes some time, and you've been in contact with all of these guys. Have you been able to talk to anyone who was on the ground just in the past couple of months to get their perspective or their sentiment on what's happened in the last 2 months as, the government has fallen again? Have you gotten any reactions from them at all since then?
Well, I've been speaking to the guys. I haven't spoken. I mean, I've spoken to Afghans who've got out. I haven't spoken to any of the Marines or soldiers who were out there as part of the sort of Kabul airport rescue mission. I mean, I've been talking to the Team Alpha guys about it, and they've kept in very sort of close touch with the situation. A lot of them spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, not just in 2001, but in the years since. But almost all of them have been very heavily involved in getting Afghan allies out. And that's an effort that's ongoing. I'm trying to get a translator that I worked with last year out. And you see the news reports of planes in Mazar-i-Sharif being sort of stopped and taken off by the Taliban. So, I mean, it's been interesting. I mean, in some ways, it's been a little bit like the team getting back together, and Shannon Spann, who was a CIA officer, left the agency about a decade ago, but Mike's widow, who since remarried, had another child, and she remarried an agency officer who's also now retired. But Shannon has been working with David and Justin Sapp and others from the team to get Afghans out, and they've had quite a lot of success. And, they've also been talking. One member of the team, Andy, is still in the CIA in a senior position. And his career is, he was a paramilitary and has stayed, not entirely, but, partly in that field. So I don't know, actually, but I presume he's been directly involved in the quite, I think, successful CIA operations to get the CIA's allies out. And in fact, I was told by one member of the team that the CIA managed to get out 32,000 people, who were basically the allies, the counterterrorism CTPTs, the counterterrorism pursuit teams that the CIA ran in Afghanistan, and all their families. So, I mean, depressing times, but I found it quite heartening, really, to see sort of ordinary Americans, maybe in a situation where the government has failed the Afghans and just banding together and getting the job done. And again, it sort of takes me back a little bit to this sort of Team Alpha and the other CIA teams after 9/11, because it's back to sort of improvisation and sort of putting procedures to one side and just focusing on results and action and how you can just make things happen.
That's fantastic. And I'm glad to see that they are still in the fight, so to speak, and that they're still supporting allies and not just leaving people behind. It's good to see some positive things coming out of this larger overall tragedy, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Toby. This has been really fascinating. I loved your book, as I've said several times already. Can you tell me where people can find your book right now? It is available in the U.S. at this time, isn't it?
That's right. Published today, September the 7th. So certainly my website, www.tobyharnden, TOBYHARNDEN.com. Links to buy it from various places there. Amazon, and I'm on Twitter as @Toby Harnden. I'm trying to be not very difficult to find right now because obviously I want people to buy the book. I think it's I need to put food on the table, but it's also I do think it's an important and
of course
there's tragedy in it, but it's also sort of quite an inspiring story, I think, about what people can do and what people can overcome. So yeah, I'm very keen for the word to be spread. It's hard to break through the news cycle, and everybody's an expert on Afghanistan at the moment.
Oh Lord, I know it. Yeah, well, I hope that you do get the book out there as much as possible. You're right, it is a very inspiring story of what people can accomplish, even facing the largest of obstacles, for sure. Are you working on another book already? Have you moved on to any other projects now that this one is done?
Not yet. I've got a couple of ideas. One that's I think is particularly promising, but I'm not going to reveal it now. Partly because I don't want to jinx it. But yeah, one of the things you try and have self-knowledge, but I find it quite difficult multitask sometimes, and I get very focused, and I'm completely immersed in having written the book. I'm still completely immersed in the book because I'm talking about it. I'm trying to sort of publicize it and encourage sales, but I'm also trying to spend some time on what's next, because we all need to think about the next things in life.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I wish you the best of luck, and I'm looking forward to anything else that you write after this as well. So thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a great interview, a great talk, and I hope that a lot of people will be inspired by this and pick up your book, because it is an amazing story for sure.
Thank you very much, Justin. I really appreciate it.
Okay, take care, Toby.
And you.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram @Spycraft101, or connect with me on Patreon. My patrons get exclusive access to long-form blog posts that dive deep into some of the most amazing stories in the history of espionage, and receive free or discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. That includes a free PDF copy of my own book, Spy Shots Volume 1, 101 True Tales from the World of Espionage. I want to say a big thank you to all of my patrons, including DJ and Thomas S. With your support, I've been able to continue funding my research and publication across multiple platforms to date. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around, because there is lots more to come.
Thanks for listening to this program brought to you by Daydreamer Network. If you enjoyed the episode, please don't forget to rate and review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred platform. Your feedback allows us to rank on the best new shows list and continue to grow our podcasts in order to bring more unique and talented storytellers to the network. To check out our shows, including programs about relationships, sports, business, nutrition, leisure, and more, head to www.daydreamernetwork.com. We look forward to seeing you back next week for another great episode. Have a wonderful day.